Caleb Thorne snatched the suitcase from Eleanor Whitmore's hands before she'd taken 3 steps off the stage, popped the latches open right there in the street, and dumped every book she owned into the mud. "There," he said, loud enough for the whole town to hear. "That's where educated women's nonsense belongs." Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. 30 pairs of eyes watched the pages of her medical texts soak through with Montana dirt, and not one person bent down to help her pick them up. If that had been you standing in that street, everything you'd worked for face down in the mud, a man you'd never met deciding in 30 seconds that your mind was your worst quality, what would you have done? Stay with Eleanor's story. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, do it now, because the story of what she did next is one you will not want to miss halfway through. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it really started. Eleanor Whitmore had exactly $43, 2 changes of clothes, and a suitcase so heavy with books that the leather handle had worn a permanent groove into her palm by the time the stagecoach pulled into Red Hollow. She had counted the money 3 times on the road from Billings. Not because she was nervous, or not only because she was nervous, but because $43 was the kind of number that required keeping track of. It was the remainder of everything after she'd paid her passage, settled what she owed the boarding house in Boston, and sent a small amount back to her younger sister, who had 3 children and a husband with a drinking problem and no particular plan for surviving winter, $43. And a letter from a man named Caleb Thorne that she had read so many times the paper had softened along the folds. "I am a man of property and ambition," the letter said, in handwriting that leaned a little to the right, like a fence post fighting wind. "I have built something worth coming to. What I require is an intelligent woman capable of managing a household with discretion and good sense. I am told you are a school teacher. I find that agreeable. A woman who understands order will adapt well to ranch life." She'd found the advertisement through Mrs. Hatch, who ran the employment bureau on Tremont Street, and who had, in Eleanor's last year in Boston, placed 13 women in Western marriages. 12 of them had written back with reasonably positive reports. The 13th had not written back at all, which Mrs. Hatch noted with the kind of professional detachment that Eleanor recognized as deliberate avoidance. Eleanor was 31 years old. In Boston, that was beginning to matter in a way it hadn't 5 years ago. The school where she had taught had closed when the parish that funded it lost its backing. She'd applied to 2 other schools. One had hired a man with half her qualifications. The other had told her, with genuine sympathy that somehow made it worse, that they'd had complaints from parents about a female instructor teaching the upper grades. She was welcome to apply again for the primary students, if she liked. She had not applied again. The decision to answer Caleb Thorne's advertisement had not felt brave at the time. It had felt like the only door that hadn't been shut yet. She told herself that on the stagecoach, in the long empty hours crossing the territory, when the landscape outside went from recognizable to vast and indifferent and slightly frightening. She told herself she was not running from anything. She was moving toward something. She believed it, more or less, until the stage rolled into Red Hollow and she saw Caleb Thorne for the first time. He was standing in front of the post office with 2 other men, and he had the particular posture of someone who expected to be looked at and usually was. Tall, solid through the shoulders, wearing a coat that cost real money. His hat was pushed back a little, casual, like he had nothing to prove. He was maybe 45, with lines around his eyes that could have come from squinting into sun or from years of a particular kind of contempt for things that didn't meet his standards. He looked at Eleanor stepping down from the stage, and she watched him take in her appearance with an efficiency that reminded her of a man checking a receipt against a list of items ordered, measuring something. And then she watched his face settle. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something more like disappointment or calculation, a small tightening around the mouth. "Miss Whitmore?" he said. Not a question. "Mr. Thorne?" She extended her hand. "It's a pleasure to—" "What's in the case?" She paused. "Books, mostly. Medical references. Teaching materials. I also have—" "Books," he repeated. The word landed with a flatness that she felt in her chest before she entirely understood why. "Yes," she kept her voice even. "I find them useful. I have some experience assisting a physician in Boston, in addition to my teaching work, and I thought the reference materials might be—" "You didn't mention that in your letters." I mentioned my interest in medicine. You mentioned you had some passing familiarity with nursing tasks. He said nursing tasks the way someone might say hobby or pastime, something women did when they ran out of more appropriate activities. That's different from hauling a case full of medical books into my house. He said my house very clearly. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. Around them, the street had the particular quality of a small town that notices everything while pretending not to notice anything. A woman near the dry goods store had stopped walking. A man leaning on the rail outside the barber shop had turned his head a few degrees. "Mr. Thorne," Eleanor said carefully, "I'm certain we'll have the opportunity to discuss my experience and how it might be useful to you, but perhaps we could begin that conversation somewhere less." He took the case from her hand. She hadn't expected that. Her fingers released it before she'd decided to let go, because the motion was quick and certain, the kind of thing that assumed cooperation rather than asking for it. He set it on the ground, popped both latches, tipped it. The books went into the mud with a series of heavy, soft sounds. Then the medical notes, loose pages she'd organized by category and bound with twine. Then a small journal she'd kept since she was 19. Then the letter he'd written her, which she'd tucked into the front pocket, and which now lay face down in the street. "There," he said, "that's where educated women's nonsense belongs." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. She stood there and looked at her books in the mud, and she thought, and she would remember this later, in the strange way that moments of shock preserve strange details. She thought about the medical reference she'd borrowed money to buy, the one on infectious disease management, and how she'd been so careful with it on the journey, keeping it wrapped in oilcloth against the weather. It was lying open now, pages down, and the mud was already dark at the edges. She did not cry. She would want to be clear about that later. Not because crying would have been weakness, but because she was somewhere past the kind of feeling that produces tears. She was in a colder place, quieter. She bent down and picked up her journal first, then the letter. Then she began stacking the books, one by one, back into the case, not caring that they were ruined. Not because she was resigned to it, because she needed to do something with her hands while she decided what came next. Caleb Thorne watched her. "You'll leave the books," he said. "I won't," she said. His eyes changed, not dramatically, just a slight shift, like a door moving on a hinge. He wasn't accustomed to that word from people who needed things from him. "You came here with nothing," he said. "You'll take what I offer you and be grateful for it, or you'll go back where you came from." "I came here with $43 and an agreement," she said. She stood up with the case. The latch wouldn't close properly, mud in the mechanism, but she held it shut with her hand. "The agreement was for a marriage. I'm here for that. What I brought with me is mine." Something moved through the gathering watchers. Not quite sound, more like a collective intake of breath. The woman by the dry goods store had stopped pretending to be elsewhere. Thorne's jaw tightened. "Get in the wagon," he said. "We'll discuss this at the ranch." "We'll discuss it when there's something worth discussing," Eleanor said. "Right now I'd like to know where I can find clean water to wipe down these books before the bindings are ruined." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then a voice from the edge of the gathering, dry, unhurried, with the kind of age in it that has stopped caring what people think. "There's a pump behind the livery stable. You're welcome to use it." An old man. White hair under a battered hat, a leather bag over one shoulder. He was looking at Eleanor with something she hadn't encountered yet since stepping off that stage. Something that looked like actual interest. Thorne shot the man a look that could have etched glass. The old man appeared not to notice. Eleanor looked at Thorne, then at the old man. Then she made a decision that would rearrange the rest of her life, though she didn't know it yet. "Thank you," she said to the old man, and she walked toward the livery stable. The old man's name was Dr. Silas Mercer, and he had been the only physician in Red Hollow for 19 years. He told her this while she worked the pump handle and let the water run over the worst of the mud, her hands going red with cold, the medical reference book spread open across a fence post to dry what could be dried. "I've been the only physician in most places I've lived," he said. He wasn't helping her clean the books. He was just there, the way old men sometimes are, present without making a point of it. It's less impressive than it sounds. Out here, physician mostly means person with ether and clean hands. "Do you have formal training?" "University of Pennsylvania. Graduated 1841. He paused. Long time ago. You're still practicing. There's nobody else. He said it without complaint. What's your background? I heard you mention assisting a physician. She told him about Dr. Harmon in Boston, who had agreed to let her observe and assist because he was overworked and underfunded, and she'd simply shown up one day and refused to leave until he gave her something useful to do. She told him about the 3 years she'd spent learning, reading everything she could find, practicing the things he'd let her practice. She told him about the infectious disease outbreak in the boarding district 2 winters ago, when Dr. Harmon had been sick himself, and she'd managed a caseload of 11 patients for 6 days, losing only 1. She said that last part carefully, the way people do when a number is both a success and a grief. Dr. Mercer was quiet for a moment. What happened with the one you lost? He asked. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. Consumption, she said. He'd been sick for months before I saw him. There wasn't anything to be done by then, but I have wondered sometimes if I'd recognize the signs differently. You're not the first physician to wonder that. He picked up one of the Dreyer books, read the spine, looked at her. These aren't nursing texts. No. You've read them? I've read most of them twice. He was quiet again, in a way that felt like thinking rather than judgment. Behind them, she could hear the sounds of the town continuing without her. A wagon. Voices. The ordinary machinery of a place that had already decided what to make of her. Thorne is going to make your life difficult, Dr. Mercer said. I've noticed. He's been the largest landowner in this county for 8 years. People here are careful about how they talk to him. He paused. Or about him. What does he actually want from a wife? The old doctor considered this with visible care. Someone to be present and quiet and not create inconveniences. He had a wife 12 years ago. She died in childbirth, took the child with her. He didn't take a second wife for a long time. People assumed he'd stay single. Then recently he started talking about the ranch needing a certain kind of management and how a capable woman might be. He stopped. I think he wanted a housekeeper he didn't have to pay. Eleanor looked at the book in her hands. The pages had dried a little crooked, the way wet paper does when it's had water and then air in quick succession. Permanently wavy, but still readable. I'm not going to be a quiet wife, she said. I suspect he's figured that out. He could send me back. He could, Dr. Mercer agreed. Would he? She didn't answer because she didn't know. She had no money to go back on. She had $43 and no real plan beyond what she'd already done, which was get off the stage and not collapse when her books were dumped in the mud. The agreement we had was binding, she said finally. He signed it, and I signed it, and there was a witness. If he sends me back without cause, he owes me travel costs and a penalty. You read the contract carefully. I read everything carefully. She paused. It's a habit. Dr. Mercer had a smile that started in the corners of his eyes before it got anywhere near his mouth. I have a great deal of paperwork, he said, that needs organizing. My handwriting is poor and my filing system is, well, a generous description would be organic. She looked at him. I can pay a small wage, he said. Nothing impressive, but it would give you reason to be in town during the day and a place to be that isn't Thorne's ranch, and he cleared his throat. And I'd welcome the company. It gets quiet. The afternoon light was starting to thin. Somewhere across the street, she could see Caleb Thorne's wagon still hitched outside the post office. He had not left. He was waiting, which she understood was its own kind of message. I'll speak to Mr. Thorne tonight, she said, about the terms of our arrangement. Good luck, Dr. Mercer said, and he said it in the tone of someone who means it specifically rather than conversationally. The ranch was 3 miles outside town, down a road that was probably manageable in better weather and deeply unpleasant in spring mud. The wagon bucked and wallowed. Thorne drove without speaking. Eleanor sat with her case on her lap and looked at the country around them. It was enormous in a way that Boston was not. Boston was enormous too, in its own way, dense and layered and full of things pressing in from every direction, but this was a different kind of large. Space that had no interest in being managed. Sky that went on past the point where the eye could hold it. She found herself thinking about her sister, about the 3 children and the husband, about the letter she'd sent last month, which had been cheerful in a way that she hoped read as sincere. Thorne spoke without looking at her. You made yourself a spectacle today. You dumped my books in the mud. You embarrassed yourself by arguing with me in public. You embarrassed yourself by treating a woman you'd agreed to marry like she was cargo you'd decided you didn't want. She kept her voice level. Not cold. That would have felt like fighting. Just level. I'd prefer we not waste time establishing that I'll disagree with you when you're wrong. That seems like information we both need to have. The silence that followed lasted long enough that she counted 15 fence posts going by. Caleb Thorne doesn't tolerate, he started. I'm sure Caleb Thorne doesn't, she said. I'm asking what you tolerate. Those aren't always the same thing. Another pause. Shorter. You have a sharp tongue. I have a direct one. I understand that those look similar from certain angles. She shifted the case on her lap. I am genuinely here to make this work, Mr. Thorne. I came a long way and I did not come lightly, and I have no interest in spending my days in conflict with you. But I need to know what you actually want from this arrangement, because what you described in your letters and what you demonstrated today are not the same thing. He turned his head and looked at her for the first time since they'd left town, studied her for long enough that she became aware of how poor the light was getting. My house runs a certain way, he said. That's not an answer. It's the one I have. She let that sit. The wagon hit a deep rut and lurched sideways, and her case slid off her knees and she caught it with both hands, mud-stained knuckles, pages still slightly warped inside. The latch had broken in the fall. It wouldn't close anymore. She was going to need $43 to do a great many things, she thought, including buying a new latch. The house was large, for a ranch house, more than she'd expected. There was actual glass in the windows, which was not a given out here, and the porch ran the full length of the front and was in reasonable repair. A woman she hadn't met yet opened the door before they reached it. Broad-shouldered, 50 or so, with the kind of face that is committed to a permanent expression of measured caution. She looked at Thorne, then at Eleanor, then at the state of Eleanor's case, and something moved through her eyes that might have been recognition. Miss Whitmore, she said. I'm Margaret. I manage the house. It's a pleasure to meet you, Margaret. Dinner's been kept warm. She looked at Thorne. Jessie's asking about the north fence again. Jessie can wait, Thorne said, and went past them both without looking back. Margaret watched him go. Then she looked at Eleanor, at the case, at the dried mud on Eleanor's hands. He do that before you got here or after, she said, nodding at the case. After, Eleanor said. About 30 seconds after. Margaret made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. Come inside, she said. I'll get you some hot water. The room she was given was at the far end of the upstairs hall. Small, clean, with a window that faced east. There was a decent bed and a washstand and a single hook on the back of the door. She set the case on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall for a while. She had not cried in the street. She did not cry now. What she did was breathe slowly, for long enough that her hands stopped feeling like they belonged to someone in the middle of an emergency. Then she opened the case and took out the medical reference, the one she'd been most careful with. The pages were still wavy, and some of them had stuck together along the edges. She worked them apart gently, one by one, the way you do with something you're not certain has survived. Most of it was still legible. She thought about Dr. Mercer's offer, about the wage that was small but present, about the filing system that was, by his own description, organic. She thought about the fact that she had absolutely no plan beyond surviving the next few days, and that this was, in itself, a kind of problem. She thought about what she knew how to do. She knew how to teach. She'd been doing it for 8 years. She knew what she'd learned from Dr. Harmon, which was more than most people assumed and less than she'd have liked. She knew how to read a contract. She knew how to walk into a situation where she wasn't wanted and stay until people ran out of reasons to make her leave. That last skill had gotten her further than any of the others, honestly. There was a knock at the door. Come in, she said. Margaret, carrying a tray with soup and a small piece of bread, and beside them a cup of something that smelled like strong tea. Mr. Thorne eats separately when he's in a mood, Margaret said, setting the tray on the washstand. Which is often. She paused. He had a wife before. You may have heard. He wasn't like this before she died, but she stopped herself the way people do when they've said more than they meant to. How long ago did she die? 12 years. Margaret straightened the tray, though it didn't need straightening. He built this house for her. She never got to see it finished. Eleanor looked at the wall again. Thought about a man who had loved someone, lost her badly, and spent 12 years turning grief into a particular shape of control. That didn't excuse anything. She was clear about that with herself. But it was information, and she'd learned a long time ago that information, properly understood, was the beginning of most things that mattered. "Thank you for the soup," she said. "We're up at 5, Margaret said. "Breakfast is at 5:30. You don't have to help, but Mr. Thorne notices when people aren't there." She paused at the door. "He'll give you trouble." "I know. Most women who came out here before, the ones who answered those advertisements—" She stopped again. Then, "Just know that I know what it's like to be new here and not sure where the ground is." Eleanor looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "I mean that." Margaret nodded once and left. The tea was very strong and slightly bitter, and Eleanor drank all of it standing at the window, looking out at the dark shape of the land past the glass. Somewhere out there, 3 miles away, Dr. Mercer's lamp was probably still burning. She didn't know yet what was going to happen. She didn't know how long she'd be here, or what form the trouble would take, or whether the $43 would be enough to build anything on. What she knew was that she had driven up a road in the dark with a man who had humiliated her in public and not broken. She had sat at a table with an old doctor and talked about medicine without apologizing for knowing things. She had carried her damaged books up the stairs and opened them to find most of the words still there. Tomorrow she would go to Thorne and tell him about Dr. Mercer's offer. She would watch his face for the thing it always revealed, and she would learn something from it. And if he told her to leave, she would figure out that problem when she arrived at it. She put down the cup, pulled the journal from the case, the one that had been face down in the mud, the one she'd written in since she was 19, and opened it to a clean page. She wrote the date. She wrote the name of the town. Then she sat there for a moment, pen in hand, and thought about what came next. "Day 1, she wrote. The book survived. She closed the journal and put it back in the case. Outside, the wind had come up. She could hear it against the glass, testing the window the way wind does in country, where it has a long way to travel before it reaches anything that will stop it. She lay down on the bed without undressing and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sound of a place that had not decided yet what to make of her. Neither had she. She was up before 5. Not because she'd slept well. She hadn't, not really. The wind had found every gap in the window frame, and the unfamiliar sounds of a working ranch had pulled her in and out of something that was more like shallow water than actual sleep. But because lying in the dark waiting for the house to wake up felt worse than just getting up and facing it. She washed her face with cold water from the basin, changed into the second of her 2 traveling dresses, and stood at the window while the sky outside went from black to a flat, uncertain gray. The land looked different in the almost dark. Less hostile, maybe. Or just less visible, which wasn't the same thing. By the time she reached the kitchen, Margaret was already there, moving through the space with the practiced economy of someone who has performed the same motions 10,000 times and no longer has to think about any of them. Coffee on. Biscuits in the oven. A side of bacon already cut and waiting. "You don't have to help," Margaret said, not looking up. "I don't mind helping." A pause. Margaret handed her a knife and nodded at a pile of potatoes without comment. They worked in silence for a few minutes, which was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. Outside, the gray was getting lighter. Eleanor could hear movement in the bunkhouse, boots, a door, voices that were still half asleep. "Is Mr. Thorne usually at breakfast?" Eleanor asked. "Always," Margaret said. "Rain, snow, sickness. He's been at that table every morning for 12 years. Says the men work harder when they know he's up before them." "Does it work?" Margaret considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "Mostly. Depends on the men. Thorne came down at 5:20, already dressed for the day, and he stopped when he saw Eleanor at the counter. Something moved across his face, surprise or possibly calculation, and then it was gone. "You're up," he said. "I'm up," she agreed. He sat at the head of the table and accepted coffee from Margaret without looking at her, which Eleanor noted as the kind of thing you either didn't notice after years or noticed every single time and chose not to address. She brought her own coffee and sat at the far end of the table, not at the foot. She wasn't ready to make that particular statement, but not in the middle either. 3 of the ranch hands came in. They were introduced as Pete, Danny, and a very large man named Holt, who apparently didn't go by any other name. They looked at Eleanor with the wary curiosity of people who had been warned about something but weren't sure yet what it was. "Miss Whitmore will be staying at the ranch," Thorne said, in the tone of a man making a business announcement. "She came west to consider a marriage arrangement. We are still—" He paused. Considering. As if she were a parcel he hadn't decided whether to return. Pete nodded and reached for a biscuit. Danny looked at his plate. Holt looked at Eleanor directly, which the others hadn't done, with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not unfriendly, but assessing. "Where from?" Holt asked. "Boston," she said. "Long way." "Yes." He nodded, apparently satisfied, and turned to his food. Thorne watched this exchange with an expression that was very flat and very still. Eleanor drank her coffee. After the hands had gone, when it was just the two of them and the sounds of Margaret cleaning in the back, Eleanor said, "I spoke with Dr. Mercer yesterday. In town." Thorne set down his cup. "I know who Dr. Mercer is. He offered me some part-time work, organizing his records and assisting with patient files." She watched Thorne's face. "A small wage. A few hours on the days I come to town. You're not here to work for Silas Mercer." "I'm not here to sit in a house and wait for you to decide what to make of me either." She said it without heat, which was harder than it sounded. "I have skills that are useful to a physician. I'd like to use them. And frankly, until we have settled what our arrangement actually is, I think it would be better for both of us if I had somewhere to be." The silence stretched. "He's a strange old man," Thorne said finally. "He seemed reasonable to me. He lets anyone into that office. Drifters, Indians, anyone who shows up. It's not appropriate for a woman in your position." "My position," she said, "is currently undetermined. You said so yourself." She stood and picked up her cup. "I'll be in town 3 days a week. I'll make sure the work here is covered before I go." She walked out before he could answer, which was not a strategy she could rely on indefinitely, but it was the correct move for that particular morning. Well, Dr. Mercer's office occupied the front half of a narrow building on Main Street, with his living quarters behind and a small examination room off to one side that smelled of carbolic and old wood, and something underneath that was just age. The particular smell of a space that has seen too many human bodies in various states of distress. The filing system was, as he had described, organic. Eleanor stood in the middle of it for a long moment on her first morning, turning slowly, taking inventory. Papers stacked on the desk, on the 2 chairs, on the windowsill. A box on the floor that appeared to be overflowing with correspondence from 1879. A shelf of medication bottles that were grouped in a way that suggested they had once had an organizing principle that had been gradually abandoned. "I may have overstated the situation," Dr. Mercer said from the doorway. "You understated it," she said, significantly. He came in and looked at a stack of papers as though seeing them for the first time. "I usually know where things are. In my head." "And when you're not here?" He paused. "That is the question, isn't it?" She started with the correspondence, because correspondence had dates and dates meant she could impose order on the chaos chronologically. Dr. Mercer watched for a while, then gave up watching and went to see a patient who had apparently been waiting in the examination room the entire time, a fact he'd forgotten to mention. She heard his voice through the wall, patient, unhurried, asking questions in the way that good physicians do, as though the answer matters. She heard a younger voice, male, defensive in the way of someone who has waited too long to mention a problem. By noon, she had cleared 1 full shelf and organized 3 years of patient correspondence into labeled folders that she'd made from brown paper and string, because there was nothing else available. Her back hurt. Her hands were gray with dust. Dr. Mercer came in at noon with 2 cups of coffee and a look at the shelf. "That's more progress than I've made in 5 years, he said. "It's not progress. It's a start." She accepted the coffee. "You have a patient who came in this morning with what sounded like a persistent cough. How long has he had it?" The doctor paused. "You could hear through the wall?" "I could hear enough. Is it productive?" "Yes." "Fever?" "Low grade. He says it comes and goes." Dr. Mercer studied her over his cup. "What's your thinking?" "I'm not diagnosing anyone," she said. I don't have that standing, but a productive cough with intermittent low fever in a young man in this climate and this kind of work. She stopped. I'd want to ask him about night sweats. Dr. Mercer was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll ask him when he comes back. He's supposed to return Thursday. A pause. You're right that I should have asked this morning. I've been wrong before, she said. Possibly I'm wrong now. Possibly. He sat down in the newly cleared chair and looked at the room. Do you know what the people in this town think of me? Tell me. They think I'm useful and slightly peculiar. They come to me when they need me, and they tolerate me the rest of the time. After 19 years, I am part of the landscape. He drank his coffee. You are not going to have that luxury. You are going to be an inconvenience that people will have to be convinced to tolerate. And Caleb Thorne is going to do his best to make that convincing harder. I know. He has a great deal of influence in this town. I know that too. Then why? He stopped. Because I don't have anywhere else to go, she said, with more directness than she'd intended. It came out flat and honest, the way things do when you're tired and not bothering with the better-sounding version. And because this is useful work, and because she looked at the shelf of medication bottles. Because I'm good at this, or I could be, if someone lets me be. Dr. Mercer looked at her for a long time. Thursday, he said, when the young man comes back, I'd like you to be here. He came back on Thursday, as promised, and his name was Daniel Reeves, 23 years old, worked on the Heart Spread about 6 miles east of town. He came in with the specific reluctance of someone who has convinced himself he's fine and is returning only under pressure from someone who knows better. Eleanor was supposed to be organizing the medication shelf. She was in the back room, not quite visible from the examination area, and Dr. Mercer did not introduce her or explain her presence, which she understood was intentional. She listened to the doctor ask about night sweats. The young man paused long enough before answering that the pause was itself informative. Sometimes, he said, not every night. How long has the cough been going on? Maybe 2 months, little more. Are you eating well? Well enough. Then with the particular resignation of someone who has stopped pretending, not as much as I used to, I don't have much appetite. Dr. Mercer's voice was very steady. Daniel, I'm going to want to examine your chest more carefully today. Through the wall, through the small gap where the examination room door hadn't latched fully, Eleanor heard everything. The doctor's measured movements, the young man's breathing, which she could hear now that she was listening for it, a slight unevenness, almost imperceptible. She had sat with 2 consumption cases in Boston. She recognized the sound. Afterward, when Daniel Reeves had gone with instructions and a folded paper of medicine and a gentleness in the way Dr. Mercer sent him out, that meant the doctor was working hard to keep his face from showing what he was thinking. Afterward, the doctor came into the back room and sat down heavily in the chair by the window. Yes, he said, before she could ask. Eleanor set down the bottle she'd been holding. He's young, she said. They usually are. He looked out the window. I've seen 3 cases this year, the cold and the dust and the conditions in the bunkhouses. He shook his head. I can slow it. I can try. But out here, without the facilities, without... He stopped. I need to write to a colleague in Billings. There's a treatment that's been showing some results. I can write the letter, she said. He looked at her. I know the literature, she said. I know what to ask and how to ask it. You tell me what you want to request, and I'll write it in the correct medical language so your colleague knows you're not guessing. The doctor was quiet long enough that she thought she'd misjudged, overstepped. All right, he said finally, after dinner. It was 4 weeks before Red Hollow decided it had an opinion about Eleanor Whitmore. The opinion came from several directions at once, the way small-town judgments usually do. Not from one source, but from a dozen accumulated observations and the particular mathematics of a place where everyone knows what everyone else is doing before it's quite finished happening. She'd been seen coming out of Dr. Mercer's office 3 mornings in a row. She'd been seen at the general store asking the owner about the shelf life of certain compounds, which he'd had to look up because he didn't know, and she'd apparently known the answer before he found it. She'd been seen, once, standing outside the barber shop while Mercer treated a man inside, the man's wife beside her, both of them talking in low, urgent voices about something the wife was too frightened to say inside. That last one was the one people talked about. The wife was Clara Briggs, whose husband had come off a horse 2 days prior, and whose arm Mercer had set, but who was having a fever that wasn't coming down the way it should. Clara Briggs was 34 and scared and had 3 children under 10 and not enough money to send for a specialist from anywhere. Eleanor had stood with her outside the barber shop and talked to her in a low voice about what the fever meant and what it didn't mean, and what signs to watch for that would mean she needed to get Mercer out of bed at any hour. She hadn't diagnosed anyone. She hadn't prescribed anything. She had told a frightened woman what to watch for, in plain language, without condescension. Clara Briggs had gone home and done exactly what Eleanor told her, and when the fever broke the following morning, she'd told her neighbor about it, and the neighbor had mentioned it at the dry goods store, and within 3 days the story had traveled through Red Hollow in the way that stories travel in small towns. Imprecisely, with additions, but with the essential truth intact. The woman staying with Caleb Thorne had told Clara Briggs what to do, and it had worked. The opinion split roughly in half. One half thought it was admirable that the town had someone with medical knowledge available, even temporarily. The other half thought there was something not quite right about a woman who talked about fevers and medications with that kind of authority, who carried books about disease and treatment, and who had, by all accounts, argued with Caleb Thorne in the street on her first day in town. That second half was louder. Eleanor heard about it secondhand through Margaret, who had a network of information that covered the entire county and which she deployed with the precision of someone who understands that information is a resource to be managed. Dolores Hatch, Margaret said one evening, not looking up from the mending she was doing, told her husband that you were practicing medicine without a license. Eleanor looked up from the letter she was drafting. I helped a woman understand a fever chart. Dolores Hatch doesn't know that. What Dolores Hatch knows is that Clara Briggs came to you instead of waiting for Silas Mercer, and that Clara Briggs's husband got better. Margaret bit a thread. People don't always like it when problems get solved in ways they didn't expect. What does Mr. Thorne think? A pause. He hasn't said anything, which is not the same as not thinking it. Thorne had, in the 4 weeks since Eleanor's arrival, settled into a particular pattern of behavior that she had come to think of as armed neutrality. He was not actively cruel, the way he had been that first day. He was not kind. He occupied the space between those things with a rigidity that felt to her like someone working very hard not to feel something, though she couldn't have said exactly what. He ate breakfast with her most mornings. He occasionally asked, in a way that was technically a question, but had the structure of a statement, about what she'd done at Mercer's office. He had not touched her case again, or the books inside it. He had not asked her to leave. She had stopped trying to understand what that meant. The night that changed things started with a sound she almost didn't hear. It was late October, and the temperature had dropped sharply in the previous week, in the way that Montana does when it decides summer is over. Not gradually, but definitively, as though a door has been closed. Eleanor had been asleep for maybe 2 hours when something pulled her partly awake, some distant sound at the edge of hearing. She lay still and listened. It came again. Not from inside the house. From outside, from the direction of the bunkhouse. She was not the kind of person who lay in bed deciding whether to investigate. This was, she knew, not always a virtue. She got up, pulled her heaviest shawl over her nightclothes, pushed her feet into boots, and went down the stairs. She found Holt on the porch, holding a lantern, with the expression of a man who is trying not to show how badly something is wrong. "Where is he?" she said. Holt blinked. "How'd you—" "Someone's hurt. Where?" He took her to the bunkhouse. A young ranch hand she'd seen before, named Will, she thought, he'd been hired only 3 weeks ago, was lying on his bunk with his hand pressed to his side and his face the color of old paper. A knife wound, she could see that immediately, a deep one, through the heavy fabric of his shirt. 2 other men were standing back with the helpless posture of people who know they're out of their depth. "What happened?" she said, already moving. "Fight outside the saloon," one of them said. "He didn't start it. Other man's gone. We don't know who he was." She pulled Holt's lantern close and looked at the wound. Deep, but not into the abdominal cavity. She was fairly certain, though not entirely certain, and the difference between those 2 things mattered enormously. The bleeding had slowed. That was good, and also potentially not good, depending on the reason. "Boil water," she said. "As much as you can and fast. I need clean cloth. Clean, not just dry, actually clean. I need the bottle of whiskey that I know is in this bunkhouse somewhere. Don't argue with me about it. And someone needs to ride for Dr. Mercer. It's midnight, someone said. Yes, she said. Ride anyway. She worked by lantern light for the next 40 minutes, doing what she could within the limits of what she knew and what she had available, which was not as much as she'd have liked and more than nothing, which was what Will had otherwise. Cleaning the wound, managing the bleeding, checking his responses, talking to him in the low, steady voice that Dr. Harmon had once told her was as important as anything you did with your hands. Not because it was comforting, exactly, but because it gave the patient something to track, some evidence that the person working on them knew what they were doing. She was not certain she knew what she was doing. She was certain that showing uncertainty would make things worse. Dr. Mercer arrived in 50 minutes, which was faster than the distance should have allowed. He came in, saw the situation, looked at what Eleanor had done, and began working beside her without preliminary comment. When it was stable, not resolved, not finished, but stable, he straightened up and looked at his own hands. You stopped the bleeding, he said. I slowed it. You stopped it. The packing you did bought him time. He looked at her. You've done this before. Once. A dock worker in Boston. Dr. Harmon walked me through it. She was tired in a way that had gone past her bones and into something deeper. Is he going to be all right? Probably, if no infection sets in. Mercer began cleaning his instruments. I'd like to move him to my office in the morning where I can watch him. She nodded. From the doorway came a voice. What happened here? Thorne. He was fully dressed, which meant he'd been awake, or nearly, which meant he'd heard the noise earlier and done nothing, or he'd heard the noise when Holt had ridden out and come after. She didn't know which. Your man was stabbed in town, Mercer said, without turning around. Miss Whitmore managed the wound until I arrived. He'll live, with luck. Thorne looked at Eleanor. She looked back, too tired to arrange her expression into anything diplomatic. You knew how to do that, he said. Yes. Who taught you? A physician in Boston, and books, and practice. She paused. And 3 years of paying very close attention. The lanterns threw shadows that moved in the draft from the open door. Will's breathing was even now, slow and regular, the particular sound of someone who has gone from a body fighting itself to a body resting. You should have woken me, Thorne said. You would have helped? She asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. He didn't answer. She hadn't expected him to. Dr. Mercer finished cleaning his hands on a cloth and turned around. He looked at Thorne with the specific patience of someone who has known a person long enough to be honest with them. She saved his life, Mercer said, or close enough to it that the difference is splitting hairs. You have a genuinely capable woman in your house, Caleb. I'm suggesting you consider not making her life harder than it already is. Thorne looked at the old doctor, at Eleanor, at Will's sleeping form. He left without responding. That was the night, though Eleanor wouldn't understand it until later, when certain things began to shift. Not quickly. Nothing in Red Hollow happened quickly, except the bad things. But Holt started nodding to her when she passed him in the morning. Pete had stopped leaving the room when she entered it. Danny, who was 19 and had a bad habit of pretending not to listen, had quietly borrowed one of her less damaged books 3 days after the incident and returned it a week later without commenting on having taken it. She noticed these things. She filed them. She was at Dr. Mercer's office on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, working through a stack of correspondence that had accumulated in a pile near the door, when she heard boots on the porch and looked up to see a man she hadn't seen before. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, she guessed, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to take up less space than they actually occupy. Not short, he had several inches on most men, but contained somehow. Careful. He was wearing a coat that had been well made once and was now well worn, and his hat was in his hands. He stood in the doorway like someone checking whether it was safe to come in. Dr. Mercer around? He said. In the back. I can get him. She paused. Are you hurt? Not recently. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. I was hoping to ask him about some medication for my horse. Your horse. She's had a swollen joint for a week, front right. I've been wrapping it, but it's not. How's she bearing weight on it? He stopped, looked at her. You know horses? I know joints. The principle is similar enough. She set down her pen. Is the swelling warm to the touch? A pause. Then he came through the door and sat down in the chair across from her desk. It was her desk now, more or less, by right of having cleared it. And they talked for several minutes about his horse's leg, and she told him what she'd have done differently from rapping, and he listened with the complete attention of someone who is used to making assessments about people quickly. I'm Cole Ransom, he said, when there was a break in the conversation. She knew the name. She'd heard it twice since arriving in Red Hollow, once from Margaret, who had mentioned him in passing as someone who lived out past the valley, and once from Pete, who had said something about Ransom's land in a context she hadn't fully caught. Eleanor Whitmore, she said. Something crossed his face. Very brief. You're staying at Thorne's place. At the moment. He looked at her in that assessing way, but there was something different in it than the way most of the town looked at her, not sizing up a problem, something closer to recognition. How's that going? He said. About as well as you'd expect, she said. He nodded, as though that were a complete answer. Dr. Mercer emerged from the back room, saw Ransom, and stopped. Something moved between the two men, not unfriendliness, but a history of some kind, a knowledge of each other that had weight. Cole, Mercer said. Silas. Ransom stood. My horse's leg. She told me what to try. He tilted his head toward Eleanor. I'll do it and come back if it doesn't work. That's... Mercer glanced at Eleanor. Yes. Good. Ransom put his hat back on. He looked at Eleanor one more time at the door with that particular look, the one that was something like recognition, but from a direction she hadn't identified yet. Appreciate the advice, he said. Come back if it doesn't help, she said. He nodded and left. Dr. Mercer came and stood at the desk and looked at the door where Ransom had been standing. What do you know about him? Eleanor asked. More than most, the doctor said, and less than I'd like. He sat down in the other chair. He runs cattle on the land past the North Ridge. He's been there about 4 years. Before that, he paused. He had a different kind of life. What kind? Mercer looked at the door. The kind you don't ask him about directly. He was quiet for a moment. He came to me 4 years ago with a bullet wound. Said he'd been shot by mistake. I didn't believe him, but I treated him, and he paid me fairly. And every year since then he's done the same. Come in once or twice, paid for what he needed, didn't cause trouble. He paused again. He's not what people in this town think he is. Neither is he what he was. Eleanor thought about the way Ransom had sat in the chair. The stillness. The way he'd listened about the horse. Not impatient, not performing interest. Actually interested. He didn't look at me like I was a problem, she said. Mercer looked at her. No, he said. He didn't. Outside, the wind had come up again. November in Montana was practicing for December, getting its edge back. Somewhere outside, she heard the sound of a horse moving away at a steady pace, and she did not know why she kept listening until it was gone. Cole Ransom came back 11 days later. His horse's leg was better. She could tell by the way he walked in, without the particular tightness around the eyes that people carry when something they care about is still wrong. He didn't announce it. He just sat down in the same chair as before and put his hat on his knee and said, It worked. Good, Eleanor said. She was stitching a torn binding on one of the medication ledgers, which was not strictly medical work, but which needed doing, and which gave her hands something to occupy while her mind ran through the list of things Dr. Mercer had asked her to review before afternoon. The swelling's gone? Mostly. She's moving right. He paused. What you described, the poultice, the cold wrap sequence, I haven't seen anyone do that before. It's in the literature. Most people don't read the veterinary literature alongside the medical. There's more overlap than you'd think. He looked at her with that look again, the one she'd been trying to categorize since the first time she saw it. It wasn't admiration exactly, or not only that, it was more like the expression of someone who has spent a long time in places where people are exactly what they appear to be, and has learned to be mildly startled when they aren't. You always read everything? He said. Since I was 8. It was a problem for certain people and not for others. She tied off the stitch on the binding. The ones who found it a problem were usually the ones who wanted me to know less than they did. He was quiet for a moment, and the way she'd begun to understand was how he processed things. Not silence as discomfort, but silence as actual thinking. Thorne giving you trouble? He said. Nothing I can't manage. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. He looked back, patient and unhurried, and she had the distinct sense that he would sit there indefinitely waiting for an honest answer. Some people had that quality. It was rarer than it should have been. He doesn't know what to do with me, she said, so he defaults to obstruction. It's manageable. It's also exhausting. She set the ledger aside. I've been told you know him. I know of him. We've spoken maybe a dozen times in 4 years. Cole turned his hat a quarter rotation in his hands. He tried to buy my land 2 years ago. I said no. He tried again 6 months later through a lawyer, made it sound like a county drainage matter when it was actually just an offer with paperwork around it. He paused. I said no again. Why does he want your land? Water. He said it the way people in dry country say it, with a weight that people who've never gone without don't quite understand. My North Ridge has a creek that runs through late summer when most of the other sources have dropped. Thorne's eastern pasture goes dry by August, has for the last 3 years. He looked at the window. He's bought up 6 parcels in this county in the last 4 years. He knows how to wait, and he knows how to apply pressure, and he's patient about both. Eleanor thought about Thorne at breakfast, with his flat expression and his habit of saying things that were technically statements but functioned as instructions. She thought about the way he'd said considering about the marriage arrangement, as though she were a line item in a ledger whose value hadn't been determined yet. Are you worried? She asked. Cole looked at her. About Thorne? A pause. I'm careful about Thorne. There's a difference. He stood. I came in to pay Mercer for the advice. It was my advice. Then I'm paying you. Dr. Mercer accepts payment for the office. I'm not... She stopped. I'm not a physician. You told me how to fix my horse's leg and it worked, he said. That's worth something regardless of what paper you do or don't have. He put his hat on. Tell Mercer I'll be back before winter closes the North Road. I want to talk to him about the Greer family up on the ridge. Their youngest has been coughing, and they're too far out to come in. He set $1 on the desk and walked out before she could respond to any part of it. She looked at the dollar for a moment. Then she put it in the drawer where Dr. Mercer kept the office funds, wrote it in the ledger under ransom, and went back to work. November deepened. The cold became serious. Dr. Mercer got sick on a Wednesday. Not dramatically, not with any of the urgency that would have made it easier to respond to, but with the slow, grinding deterioration of a man who has been running on insufficient rest for 19 years and whose body has finally decided to present the bill. It started as a cough. She noted it on Wednesday, mentioned it Thursday, and was told by the doctor with the magnificent irritability of physicians who make terrible patients that he was fine and she should focus on the Henderson file. By Friday morning, he was running a fever of 102 and could not stand without holding the wall. Eleanor stood in the doorway of his living quarters and looked at him sitting on the edge of his bed and made a decision that she was fairly sure was correct and which he was going to find objectionable. You are not seeing patients today, she said. I have 4 appointments. I'll reschedule them. Mrs. Garfield can't be rescheduled. She's coming in from 15 miles out and she... Tell me what you need to check with Mrs. Garfield, Eleanor said. Tell me what to look for, what to ask, what concerns you have about her case. Write it down if it's easier. I'll see her and I'll report everything to you afterward, and you can make any decisions that need making from this bed. He stared at her. I am not practicing medicine, she said carefully. I am taking a thorough patient history and noting observations that you will then evaluate. There is a difference. A thin one. A sufficient one. She came in and put her hand to his forehead, which was not a clinical gesture but was an accurate one. He was hot in the particular way that meant the fever was climbing, not stable. You need fluids and rest, and you need to stop arguing with me about it. I know what I'm doing. You know what you know, he said, which is more than most, which is also not the same as Dr. Mercer. She sat down in the chair beside his bed. She looked at him directly. I helped Will Hartley survive a knife wound in a bunkhouse by lantern light. I have managed 11 patients solo during a winter outbreak in Boston. I have read every reference text you own and several you don't. I am not asking you to trust me blindly. I am asking you to trust that I will tell you everything I observe, and I will not do anything beyond what we have agreed I can do. She paused. And I am asking because there is nobody else. He was quiet for a long time. The window behind him was gray with cloud, the particular gray that meant snow before nightfall. "Mrs. Garfield," he said. "She's 61. She's been having chest pain that she describes as pressure, worse on exertion, better at rest. I've been monitoring her for 6 months. What I need to know today is whether the pattern has changed, whether the pain is occurring at rest now, or lasting longer, or radiating somewhere new." "I know what that presentation means," she said. "I know you do." He lay back. "The Henderson file is on the left side of my desk. The new medication I ordered from Billings arrived yesterday. It's in the cabinet, third shelf, labeled in red. Don't let anyone talk you into dispensing anything you're not certain about." "I won't." "And Eleanor," he closed his eyes, "if anything happens that you're not sure about, anything at all, you come get me." "I will," she said. "Rest." Mrs. Garfield arrived at 10 o'clock in a wagon driven by her son-in-law, who was clearly uneasy about the substitute and who expressed this by hovering in the doorway until Eleanor looked at him with an expression that encouraged him to wait outside. She was small and white-haired and had the posture of someone who has never in her life asked for help she didn't absolutely need. She looked at Eleanor with the measuring look that older women sometimes use, the kind that takes in everything at once without being impolite about it. "Where's Silas?" she said. "He's resting. He's not well today." Eleanor gestured to the chair. "I'm Eleanor Whitmore. I've been assisting Dr. Mercer for the past several weeks. He's asked me to take your history today, and he'll review everything I note and determine next steps." Mrs. Garfield sat. "You a doctor?" "Not by formal credential." "Silas trust you?" "He's giving me the opportunity to demonstrate that he should." Eleanor sat across from her and opened the patient ledger to Mrs. Garfield's file. "I understand you've been having chest pain." They talked for 40 minutes. Mrs. Garfield was precise and observant and had kept her own notes in a small diary, dates, duration, descriptions, that she produced from her coat pocket and handed to Eleanor without being asked. The pain had changed. It was occurring now at rest twice in the past week, lasting 15 minutes each time. The first time she'd thought it was indigestion. The second time she'd known it wasn't. Eleanor wrote everything down. She asked every question on Dr. Mercer's list and several that weren't, about sleep, about ankle swelling, about how many steps she could take on level ground before the feeling started. When she was done, she went to the back room and told Mercer what she'd found, all of it, in the order she'd found it. He listened with his eyes closed. When she finished, he was quiet for 30 seconds. "She needs to go to Billings," he said. "I've been putting it off because she won't want to go and because the journey in winter is its own risk. But she can't wait until spring." He opened his eyes. "Tell her that." In those words, "She can't wait until spring. She'll push back. Hold your ground." "All right. Tell her I said so specifically. She'll argue less if she thinks it's from me." Eleanor went back to the examination room and told Mrs. Garfield what Dr. Mercer had said in those words, and was correct that she pushed back 3 separate rounds of reasons why Billings was impractical, too expensive, too far, too much trouble, and held her ground through all 3, and by the end Mrs. Garfield had her diary back in her pocket and a letter Eleanor had written to a cardiologist in Billings folded into her other hand. "You're stubborn," Mrs. Garfield said at the door. "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "Good." The older woman looked at her for a moment. "Silas is lucky to have you." She said it briskly, the way you say something true without wanting to make a production of it. Then she went to her waiting son-in-law, and Eleanor watched the wagon turn and head south. She stood on the porch for a moment in the cold air and let herself feel, briefly, the particular satisfaction of having done something that mattered. Then she went back inside because there were 4 more appointments, and the Henderson file still needed reviewing and Dr. Mercer needed broth. And she didn't have time for more than a brief visit to the feeling before moving on. Well, that was the week everything cracked open. Dr. Mercer's illness lasted 9 days. During those 9 days, Eleanor ran the office. She did not call herself a physician, and she did not make diagnoses, and she did not prescribe medication without running it past Mercer first. But she did everything adjacent to those things, with a thoroughness and a steadiness that the people who came through the office door registered in the way that people register competence when they encounter it unexpectedly, which is sometimes with gratitude and sometimes with the specific unease of someone whose idea of the world has just been slightly revised. Most of the patients who came during those 9 days were women or children or working men without the luxury of being particular about who treated them. Most of them were fine, or going to be fine, or needed things that were in the range of what Eleanor could provide. One of them, a boy of 9 with a badly infected cut on his hand, was not fine and might not have been, and Eleanor spent 3 hours managing the infection with the particular focused calm that she'd learned from Dr. Harmon was more useful than any instrument she could hold. The boy recovered. His name was Thomas Briggs, Clara Briggs's oldest, the one whose father had come off the horse in October. Clara Briggs did not say anything dramatic about this. She came in to pick up Thomas, and she looked at his hand, which was clean and properly wrapped, and she looked at Eleanor and she said, "I'll tell people." "You don't have to," Eleanor said. "I know," Clara said. "I want to." That was the part that mattered. Not the 9 days exactly, but what came after them. The man who made everything harder was named Victor Blackwell, and Eleanor heard his name for the first time from Cole Ransom on a cold Thursday in late November, the same day Dr. Mercer finally came back to his desk looking pale and 15 years older but upright. Ransom had come in with a different reason this time. Not the horse, but a question about one of the Greer children on the North Ridge, the coughing youngest that he'd mentioned weeks ago. He'd apparently been checking on them himself, which Eleanor filed under things about this man that don't match what the town says about him. "The cough isn't improving," he said. "They can't get to town until the road clears. I'm trying to figure out what to bring them." They were standing at the edge of the porch because Dr. Mercer had a patient inside, and the office was too small for more than 2 people with any comfort. The cold was the kind that had teeth, but not yet the full force of December. "How old?" she asked. 7. "A girl. She's small for her age." "Productive cough or dry?" "Productive. Her mother says she's been running a low fever for 3 weeks. Eleanor thought about Daniel Reeves, the ranch hand from October, whose treatment was ongoing. About the pattern. About the bunkhouse conditions and the cold in the close quarters of a cabin family in winter. "I can put together a kit," she said. "What to watch for, what to try first, what to do if it doesn't respond. You'd have to explain it to her parents." "I can do that." "It's not a diagnosis," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "You're clear about that a lot," he said, not unkindly, "because the line matters." He looked at her sideways. The cold had put color in his face that wasn't usually there, made him look slightly more present than his usual careful restraint. "You know what I think? I think you know exactly what you're doing, and you know what the outcome would be, and you're protecting yourself from people who'd use it against you." She looked at the street. A wagon passing. A woman she didn't know walking quickly with her head down against the cold. "That's not inaccurate," she said. "Blackwell's in town," he said, shifting. The name meant nothing to her yet. "Who?" "Victor Blackwell. He runs a land development operation out of Helena. He's been buying water rights in this county for 2 years. Cole's voice was level, the way it always was, but something underneath it had gone slightly harder. "He's been in Thorne's house twice this week." She was quiet. "I have a guess about what they're discussing," he said. "And the guess involves the North Ridge water and my deed and a legal argument that is incorrect but which a good attorney could make complicated." "What kind of legal argument?" "There's a provision in the Territorial Land Code about water access rights for downstream owners. Blackwell's been using it in 2 other counties to challenge deeds that predate certain survey records." He looked at her. "He's good at it. He picks people who don't have the resources to fight back at the level he fights." "What resources would you need?" "A lawyer I can afford and documentation I can produce fast." A pause. "I have the deed. I have the survey records. What I don't have is time, because once he files the challenge, it goes to the county board and Thorne has 2 men on that board." Eleanor thought about Thorne's flat expression at breakfast, about considering, about the patience of a man who knew how to apply pressure and weight. "Is he doing this because of me?" she asked. She said it directly because she had learned that was the only way to get direct answers. Cole looked at her. "What? Is Thorne pursuing your land more aggressively because having me here is an embarrassment and he needs something to focus his energy on? Or was this already in motion?" A pause. "This was in motion before you arrived, but—" He stopped. "You're asking if you've accelerated it?" "Yes." "I don't know," he said. And that was the truth. She could tell, the actual truth, rather than a diplomatic softening of something worse. What I know is that Blackwell's presence here right now is not coincidental, and Thorne's been talking to him for at least 6 months. She thought about that. About the way things connected that you didn't see connecting until you were looking at them from the right angle. Can I see the deed, she said, and the survey records? He looked at her. I organized 3 years of legal and medical correspondence for Dr. Mercer, she said. I know how documents are structured and I know what makes an argument hold or fall apart. I'm not a lawyer, but I can tell you if what you have is complete or if there are gaps Blackwell can get leverage on. The street noise continued, indifferent. Somewhere a door slammed. All right, Cole said. Cool. He brought them 2 days later on a Saturday morning when the first real snow of November was coming down in the tentative way that meant it wasn't serious yet but was making a point about what was coming. He spread them on Dr. Mercer's cleared desk. Eleanor had made sure to clear it the night before, knowing he was coming, and stood back while she looked. The deed was clear. The survey records were mostly clear. There was one gap. She found it in 20 minutes, which was both faster than Cole had expected and more sobering than she'd have liked to be. A secondary survey conducted in 1871, 3 years before Cole's deed was issued, that established the creek as a navigable waterway under territorial designation. If that designation held, it changed the water rights question substantially. And if Blackwell had found it, which, given what Cole had said about his methods, he almost certainly had, it was the exact kind of technical discrepancy that looked complicated enough to stall a county board and buy time for other maneuvers. This is the problem, she said, pointing. Cole looked at where her finger rested. His face didn't change much, but something around his jaw settled. Can it be countered? He asked. Possibly. A navigable waterway designation can be challenged if the creek doesn't meet the criteria: depth, consistent flow, use history. If the creek drops significantly in dry years, that's an argument. If there's documentation of the creek being used privately rather than commercially for more than a decade, that's an argument. She looked up. Do you have anyone who's been on that land longer than you have? Anyone who knew it before 1874? He thought. There's an old trapper, Gus Heller. He's been in this valley for 30 years. He knows that creek. Get him to make a written statement. Date it. Have it witnessed. Have it notarized if you can find someone to do it. She looked at the deed again. And you need to file a preemptive notice with the county recorder before Blackwell files his challenge. If you file first, it changes the procedural order. He has to respond to you instead of the other way around. Cole was looking at her with that look again, the recognition one. How do you know this? He said. I read the territorial land code the second week I was here. I was trying to understand the contract I signed with Thorne. She paused. I thought at the time that it was just useful to know, as it turns out. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she hadn't expected. I owe you an apology. For what? I've known for 2 weeks that Thorne was putting pressure on people in town about you, about your work here, about whether you were qualified to be doing what you're doing. I didn't tell you. She looked at him steadily. What kind of pressure? Conversations, questions, the kind of thing that's technically opinion but is really instruction. He met her eyes. He told Henderson at the general store that he was concerned about people relying on someone with no formal standing. He told the Deacon family you'd overstepped when you treated their boy. He paused. He said it quietly, and he said it to the right people. The cold in Eleanor's chest was not from the November snow. Why didn't you tell me sooner, she said. Because I didn't know if I was reading it right, and because, a pause shorter than his usual ones, because telling you meant I was involved, and I've spent 4 years trying not to be involved in things that aren't my business. And now? He looked at the deed on the table. Now it's my business whether I want it to be or not. He picked up the survey map. I'll find Heller, I'll get the statement, and I'll go to the county recorder Monday morning. He stopped. And you should know what's coming. Tell me. Blackwell is going to move soon. He doesn't wait once he's in position. And when he does, Thorne is going to have a reason to make more noise about you, Wes. Because you're here. Because you're connected to Mercer's office. Because you're connected to me now by this conversation. He'll use it. What will he do? He'll find the thing that looks most like a formal complaint. An unqualified woman practicing medicine without a license is the kind of thing the county board takes seriously. He set the map down. You need to be ready for that. Eleanor looked at the desk. At the organized files, the labeled ledgers, the system she'd built from nothing in 8 weeks. At the letter from Mrs. Garfield's cardiologist in Billings that had arrived Thursday, confirming the appointment, which Mercer had read and then set aside without saying anything because he didn't trust himself to say it without becoming emotional about it. "I've been ready for it," she said. "I've been waiting for it since the first week." Thorne came to her that Sunday evening. Not aggressively, not the way he'd been that first day in the street, loud and certain and performing dominance for an audience. He came quietly, which was in some ways worse. He came to the parlor where she was reading and sat down in the chair across from her and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something careful in it. Calculated, but also something underneath the calculation that might have been discomfort. "I've heard things," he said. "I imagine you have," she said. She didn't close her book. "You've been treating patients in Mercer's office." "I've been assisting Dr. Mercer, as I've done for 8 weeks. During his illness, you were seeing patients alone. I was taking histories and making observations that Dr. Mercer reviewed from his bed." She kept her voice level. "He made every clinical decision. I was his hands. How people are describing it. Then people are describing it wrong." She closed the book. Not because she was done reading, but because she wanted him to have her full attention so he could see that she wasn't afraid of it. "What specifically concerns you, Mr. Thorne?" "Your position here is uncertain," he said. "If there are complaints to the county board about someone in my household practicing medicine without a license, that reflects on this ranch." There it was. Not concern for the patients, not concern for her, concern for the ranch, for his name and its standing. "I'm not in your household," she said. "I'm a woman who came to your town under a marriage arrangement that you've spent 8 weeks not honoring. I'm staying in your house under an interim agreement that neither of us has formalized. If my presence here embarrasses you, Mr. Thorne, you have options." He looked at her with that flat, assessing look. "I could end the arrangement." "You could. The contract specifies the conditions under which that can be done without penalty and the conditions under which it cannot. I suggest you review it before deciding." She stood. "I'm going to continue working with Dr. Mercer. I'm going to continue using the knowledge I have to help the people in this town who need it. If that causes you difficulty, I am genuinely sorry. Not for doing it, but for the difficulty." She picked up her book. "Good night, Mr. Thorne." She was at the door when he said, "Victor Blackwell is a business partner of mine." She stopped. "He's been a partner for 2 years, Thorne said. He has considerable influence with the county board." She turned. "Is that a warning?" He held her gaze for a long moment. His face was very difficult to read, and she'd been studying it for 8 weeks. "I don't know what it is," he said. And that small admission, "I don't know," was the most honest thing he'd said to her since she arrived. She looked at him. This man who had dumped her books in the mud, who had built a house for a woman who'd never seen it finished, who had spent 12 years turning loss into a very particular shape of cruelty and called it management. "Then figure it out," she said, "before someone else does." She told Cole about the conversation the next morning, catching him at the county recorder's office after he'd filed the preemptive notice. He listened without interrupting. "Blackwell and Thorne," he said. "Not a surprise, but good to have it confirmed." He said it like he wasn't certain whether he was threatening me or warning me. Maybe he isn't certain. That might be more dangerous. Certain men are predictable. Cole looked at the recorder's office door, the envelope he'd just handed through the window. "I talked to Heller last night. He'll give the statement. He says he's been fishing that creek since 1858, and he'll say so in front of whoever he needs to say it to." "Good." She pulled her coat tighter. The snow from the weekend had settled and was staying. "What happens when Blackwell makes his move?" "He'll file the water rights challenge. He'll file it with the county board within the next 2 weeks, I'd guess, before the December session closes. Then it goes to a hearing." He paused. "Those 2 men on the board that Thorne controls, they're not corrupt exactly. They're just careful about who they inconvenience. Is there anyone on the board who isn't careful in that way?" "One woman, Ruth Casper. She's been on the board for 3 years, and she doesn't care what Thorne thinks because she never has, and she's not starting now." He paused. "She's heard of you." Eleanor looked at him. "What has she heard?" "Clara Briggs is her niece," Cole said. And something in the way he said it, with that flat, understated quality he gave to important things, made Eleanor understand that this was significant before she'd worked out exactly how. The cold was serious now, the kind of cold that gets into your teeth when you talk. Somewhere down the street, she could hear the sound of the farrier's hammer. "Cole," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever is coming. Blackwell, the board, Thorne." She stopped, organized what she wanted to say. "I'm not leaving. I want you to know that, whatever they do." He looked at her for a moment. The cold had gone very still, the kind of stillness that happens before weather changes. "I know," he said. "I'm saying it so there's no ambiguity." "There isn't any," he said. "There hasn't been since you told that man outside the barber shop to wait outside and then went in and handled his wife's question without anyone having to hold your hand." He picked up his hat from where he'd tucked it under his arm and put it on. "I'll be back in town Friday. There's something Blackwell filed last year in Jefferson County that I want to get a copy of. If his method is consistent, it'll tell us what his next move is." She nodded. "And Eleanor." He said her name plainly, no ceremony in it, just the name. "What you've built here in 8 weeks, the trust with these people, the work in Mercer's office, that's not nothing. Blackwell's going to try to make it look like nothing. Don't let him." She looked at him, at the snow-gray street behind him, at the county recorder's window where Cole's notice was now formally filed, officially part of the record, no longer just an intention, but a fact. "I don't plan to," she said. He nodded once and walked to his horse. She watched him go, and she thought about what Dr. Mercer had said. He is not what people in this town think he is, neither is he what he was. And she thought that was probably true of most people who survived long enough to be misread. She turned and walked back toward the office. She had 3 patients this afternoon in Mercer's afternoon medication reviews and a letter to draft to the county board secretary about the formal scope of medical assistant duties under territorial law, which she had looked up the previous evening and which contained, she had found, more support for her position than she'd expected. The snow was coming down again, lightly, the sky the color of old pewter. She walked into the office and hung her coat and sat at her desk. She picked up her pen. The letter from the county board arrived on a Friday. Eleanor was alone in the office when it came. Dr. Mercer was doing a house call on the east side of town, the first since his illness, moving carefully but moving. And the boy who brought it was maybe 12, one of the Henderson children, who handed it over with the particular gravity of someone who has been told the errand is important without being told why. She read it standing at the desk. It was formal language, county board language, the kind that uses 20 words where 4 would do. The substance was this. A complaint had been filed with the board regarding the unlicensed provision of medical services at the office of Dr. Silas Mercer of Red Hollow. The board was required by territorial statute to investigate. A hearing had been scheduled for the 14th of December, 11 days away. Dr. Mercer was requested to appear. Miss Eleanor Whitmore was requested to appear. At the bottom, in the space where the filing party was named, it said, "Victor Blackwell, on behalf of concerned citizens of Red Hollow County." She set the letter on the desk. She stood there for a moment with her hands flat on the wood and breathed. Then she picked up her pen and started making a list. Dr. Mercer came back at 2 o'clock and read the letter in the chair by the window, his coat still on, not speaking. When he finished, he folded it along its original lines with the careful precision of a man who is controlling something by keeping his hands occupied. "It was only a matter of time," he said. "I know. I should have been clear about the boundaries of what you were doing. If I had been more formal about it from the beginning, it wouldn't have mattered," she said. "They weren't going to complain about boundaries. They were going to complain about the fact of me." She pulled her chair closer to his. "I've been researching territorial statute on medical apprenticeship. There's a provision, it's not widely used, but it's there, that allows a licensed physician to formally designate an apprentice who can perform specific enumerated tasks under supervision. If you designate me formally in writing, filed with the board before the hearing, it changes the legal question." He looked at her. "Instead of was Eleanor Whitmore practicing medicine without a license," she said, "the question becomes, was Eleanor Whitmore operating within the terms of a legally recognized apprenticeship? Those are different questions and they have different answers." Mercer was quiet for a long time. Outside, the street noise continued, ordinary and unhurried. Someone was shouting about a loose horse, life going on without concern for county board hearings. "If I do this," he said slowly, It formalizes your position here, officially, permanently, as long as the arrangement holds. Yes. Blackwell will argue that I'm trying to evade the complaint retroactively. He'll try, but the apprenticeship provision doesn't have a retroactive limitation. I checked. She paused. And the things I did during your illness, the patient histories, the observations, the decisions I deferred to you on, those are all consistent with what an apprentice is permitted to do. We weren't evading anything. We just didn't have the paperwork. He looked at his hands, the hands of a man who had practiced medicine for 43 years, and who was, she understood, thinking about what it meant to put his name formally next to hers. The risk of it, the weight of it. There's more, she said. I've been reaching out to patients, the ones I worked with directly who are willing to speak at the hearing. Clara Briggs, the Deacon family. Thomas's hand healed cleanly. There's no dispute about that. Will Hartley from Thorne's Ranch. She paused. Mrs. Garfield wrote a letter. She got it to me through her son-in-law. She says she'll appear in person if the road is clear. Mercer looked up. Lillian Garfield would come all the way from... She's already planning to come to Billings in January. She said she'd come here first. Eleanor looked at him. These people want to speak. I didn't ask them to. I told Clara Briggs about the hearing, and she told me she'd already heard, and she'd already decided, before I said a word. The afternoon light was going thin. In December it went early and fast, like someone pulling a curtain. Sign the apprenticeship designation, Eleanor said. Let me build the record, and let the people who want to speak, speak. Mercer looked at her for a long time. Then he reached across to his desk, opened the center drawer, and took out a sheet of his official letterhead. Tell me exactly what the statute requires, he said. Word for word. Cole came back from Jefferson County on Thursday with a manila folder of documents and a look on his face that was flat, in the particular way that meant he'd found something worse than he expected. He spread them on the desk without preamble. Blackwell filed the same water rights challenge in Jefferson County 14 months ago, he said. Same structure, same navigable waterway argument. The landowner there was a widow named Pratt. She had the deed, she had the survey records, she had a lawyer. He pointed to a document dated March. He lost at the county board level, so he appealed to the territorial court. Did she win the appeal? She did. 14 months later, with $800 in legal fees. He looked at Eleanor. She had $800. She was a widow with a cattle operation that was doing reasonably well. A pause. I don't have $800. Not liquid. Eleanor looked at the documents. But the precedent helps. It doesn't win the case automatically. He'll argue the creek conditions are different, the survey records are different. He'll find a way to make it take time and cost money. Cole picked up one of the pages. What this tells me is that he always intended to go past the county board. The county board is just the first move. He files the challenge, ties up the deed in dispute, and then makes an offer to buy the land while the case is pending. The offer is always below market value. And the owner, by the time the case has been running for 6 months, is tired and short of cash, and he stopped. He's done it 4 times. I found 3 of them in the territorial records. The office was very quiet. The preemptive notice you filed, Eleanor said. Does it change the timeline? It means he has to respond to my filing first. It slows him down by maybe 3 weeks. Cole set the pages down. Not enough, she thought. She looked at the documents, at the dates, at the pattern that was visible now that you knew what you were looking at. A man who had refined a method, who understood that exhaustion and financial pressure were more reliable tools than any legal argument. The Pratt widow, she said. Do you have her name? Margaret Pratt operates out of Dillon. Do you have a way to reach her? Cole looked at her. I could write. Write today. Tell her what you have. Ask her specifically what arguments worked and which ones didn't, and who her lawyer was. Eleanor stood and moved to the window. The snow outside was steady, the kind that intended to stay. And there's something else. The hearing about me is December 14th. Blackwell is going to be there. It's his complaint. If we can demonstrate to the board in that hearing that Blackwell and Thorne are operating together, that this complaint is part of a larger pattern to consolidate land and control in this county, it changes how the board reads everything that comes after. Cole was watching her. Ruth Casper is on the board, she said. You told me she doesn't care what Thorne thinks. She doesn't. Who are the other 2? the ones who are careful about inconveniencing Thorn. Frank Abernathy, Harold Teague. Tell me about them, not what they think about Thorn. Tell me what they care about, what they're afraid of, what they want for this county. He looked at her for a long moment. You're thinking about this differently than I expected. I'm not trying to win a legal argument, she said. I'm trying to change what question they're asking when they walk into that room. She looked at him. Abernathy and Teague aren't bad men. They're careful men. If I can give them a reason to be careful in a different direction. What direction? The direction where a man from Helena, with a history of stripping land from county residents, looks like a bigger problem than a woman who helped Clara Briggs's son's hand heal cleanly. The fire in the small stove was burning down. Neither of them moved to add wood for a moment, both of them thinking through what the next 11 days looked like. Abernathy has a daughter, Cole said slowly. She's been sick on and off this past year. His wife mentioned it at the feed store. Nothing serious, but ongoing. Mercer's been treating her. A pause. If Eleanor Whitmore was someone who'd helped his daughter, and he knew it before he walked into that hearing room, I'm not going to manufacture anything, she said immediately. I'm not suggesting that. I'm asking if you've seen Abernathy's daughter as a patient. She thought. A girl about 7? Recurrent ear trouble? That's her. Eleanor remembered. October during Mercer's illness. One of the 9 days. A small girl with her father who had been too proud to show that he was frightened and therefore had shown it in every other way. She had been patient with both of them. He was there, she said. He saw what I did. Then he knows. He doesn't need to be told. Cole picked up his hat. What he needs is for it to be in his head when he sits down in that hearing room. Not because someone put it there, but because he remembers it. She nodded slowly. I'll write to Mrs. Pratt today, he said, and I'll talk to Gus Heller about the notarization. The county recorder in town does it for $2. There's one more thing, she said. Thorn, he paused. He told me Blackwell was his business partner, she said. He told me the night Blackwell arrived. He said it the way people say things, when they're not sure if it's a warning or a threat. She looked at the window. I think he's not entirely comfortable with what Blackwell is doing. I think there's a version of Thorn who made a business arrangement and is now watching it go further than he expected. That doesn't make him an ally. No, but it might make him unpredictable. And unpredictable is sometimes useful. She looked at Cole. I'm going to talk to him, tonight. Cole looked at her steadily. Be careful. I'm always careful. You're precise, he said. That's not the same thing. She thought about that after he left, standing at the window watching the snow. He wasn't wrong. Well, she talked to Thorn after dinner, in the parlor, in the same chairs they'd sat in when he'd told her about Blackwell. She had chosen that deliberately. Same room, same arrangement, but this time she had asked for the conversation rather than him. He was guarded when he came in. She could see it in the way he sat, slightly forward, the posture of a man who has decided he might need to move quickly. The hearing is December 14th, she said. I know. Blackwell filed it. I know that too. A pause. It was his decision. Was it? Thorn looked at her. What does that mean? It means I'm asking whether he made that decision independently or whether it was something you discussed. She kept her voice even. I'm not accusing you of anything, Mr. Thorn. I'm trying to understand what's actually happening, because understanding it is the only way I know how to respond to it usefully. He was quiet for a moment. The fire was going. Outside, the snow was still falling. Victor is... He stopped, started again. Victor operates in ways that I don't always anticipate. What I agreed to was a business arrangement around water access and land valuation. What he does with that arrangement is sometimes more aggressive than I expected. Do you know about the cases in Jefferson County and 2 others? A very slight shift in his face. What cases? She told him. Briefly, factually, the pattern she and Cole had pieced together from the territorial records. The challenges filed, the exhausted landowners, the below-market offers made during pending litigation, the 4 instances she could document. Thorn listened without moving. That's not what I agreed to, he said, when she finished. I believe you, she said, which is why I'm telling you. He looked at the fire. Cole ransoms land, she said. His deed is clean. His survey records support his claim. Gus Heller has been on record as a witness to the creek's history for 30 years. If Blackwell pursues this challenge, he's going to lose. It's going to take 14 months and cost Cole ransom money he doesn't have easily, and at the end of it, Blackwell loses. She paused. And your name is on the partnership. Thorne was very still. When the territorial records are examined, she said carefully, the connection between Blackwell's challenges and your land acquisition will be visible. It's already visible to anyone who knows how to look. A county board hearing about an unlicensed medical assistant is a small thing, but it puts people in a room together, and people in a room together start asking questions. Are you threatening me? He said. His voice was flat. No, she said. I'm telling you what I see because I think you're a man who makes better decisions with complete information than with partial information. She met his gaze. I think you loved someone and you lost her, and it made you into someone who needs to control everything because the one thing you couldn't control destroyed something you built. I think Victor Blackwell recognized that and made you a useful offer at the right moment. And I think you are now watching it go somewhere you didn't intend. The silence was long. The fire shifted. You're very direct, he said finally. You told me I had a sharp tongue. I was wrong about what I meant. He looked at her. What do you want from me? I want you to withdraw your support from Blackwell's complaint. Not publicly, if you're not willing to do it publicly. Just stop supporting it. Stop providing him cover in this county. She paused. And I want you to leave Cole Ransom's land alone. The water. Your eastern pasture has a drainage problem that has nothing to do with Cole Ransom's creek, she said. You need irrigation infrastructure, not someone else's water rights. That's a solvable problem with the right engineering. It costs money, but it's not Cole's money to cost. She paused. I've talked to men who know this land. Thorne looked at her for a long time. You've been busy, he said. I've been paying attention. He stood and walked to the window. Stood there with his back to her for long enough that she couldn't tell what it meant. The snow outside was steady. The land past the glass was dark. I'll think about it, he said. That's all I'm asking. I'm not promising anything. I know. She stood. Neither am I. But the days between that conversation and the hearing were the kind of days that have too much in them. Eleanor worked in the mornings at the office. Mercer had signed the apprenticeship designation, which had been filed with the board secretary on Monday morning, and which Blackwell's lawyer had responded to with a formal objection that was itself a kind of evidence that they'd found the right pressure point. She spent afternoons organizing the testimony they had, reviewing what each person would say, identifying the gaps. Clara Briggs came in on a Tuesday with her husband, who had recovered fully from the arm injury, and who sat in the chair across from Eleanor with the discomfort of a man who is about to say something he finds difficult. I want to speak at the hearing, he said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He looked at his wife, at his hands. You helped my son. You helped my wife when she was scared and nobody else was saying anything useful. I want to say so where it counts. It could be uncomfortable, Eleanor said. Blackwell's lawyer will ask you questions. Let him. He looked at her directly. I'm not afraid of a lawyer from Helena. Daniel Reeves, the ranch hand with the cough, who had been in Mercer's office in October, whose treatment had been ongoing and who was slowly and with difficulty getting better, sent word through a friend that he would come if they needed him. She sent word back that yes, they did. Holt, from Thorne's ranch, appeared at the office on a Wednesday without announcement and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. Will Hartley can't travel, he said, his side still not right for riding, but I was there. He looked at her steadily. I saw what you did. I can say what I saw. She looked at the large man in the doorway, who had nodded to her in the mornings for 8 weeks, who had handed her the lantern that night and led her to the bunkhouse without question. Thank you, she said. He nodded once and left. Ruth Casper came to the office on Thursday, which Eleanor had not expected. She was a compact woman in her 60s with iron gray hair and the absolute absence of concern for what people thought of her that Eleanor had been told about, but now saw directly. She sat in the patient chair and folded her hands and looked at Eleanor without preamble. I'm on the board, she said. I want you to know that I'm aware I shouldn't be talking to you about this hearing. I'm talking to you anyway because I've been watching this town for 30 years, and I know what Victor Blackwell does, and I want to make sure you know what you're walking into. Tell me, Eleanor said. He'll bring a physician, from Billings or Helena, someone credentialed and formal who will testify about the standards of medical practice and what constitutes unlicensed activity. He'll make it a technical argument so that the human question, "Did you help people?" gets buried under the legal question. She paused. Abernathy and Teague are not bad men, but they respect credentials and they're nervous about the territorial medical board coming down on the county if they set a precedent that's too loose. "I know," Eleanor said. "That's why the apprenticeship designation matters. It changes the credential question." "Mercer's been here 19 years, Ruth said. "His signature means something. It won't be dispositive, but it matters." She looked at Eleanor with the direct gaze of a woman who has attended a great many meetings and knows how they actually work. What matters more is what people in that room feel before the formal arguments start. Feelings first, justification second. That's how it works. And anyone who tells you different has never actually sat in one of those chairs. What do you suggest? Don't make this about your rights or your qualifications first. Make it about the people you helped. Lead with that, and let the legal argument be the foundation under it, not the front door. She stood. "That's all I came to say." She left, and Eleanor sat with that for a long time, turning it in her mind, rearranging the order of what she'd planned. Victor Blackwell she saw for the first time 2 days before the hearing. He was coming out of the land office when she was walking past it, and she recognized him from the description Cole had given. Middle 50s, well-dressed in the particular way of men who want to be taken seriously, carrying a leather briefcase with brass fittings that caught the thin December light. He looked at her, and she understood immediately that he knew who she was. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Blackwell." He had the pleasant, practiced expression of a man who has learned that seeming reasonable is more effective than seeming threatening. "I hope you understand that what's happening here is nothing personal. It's a matter of public safety and standards of care." She looked at him. "That's a careful way to describe a filing made on behalf of a man who wants his neighbor's water rights." His expression didn't change, which was itself informative. "The complaint stands on its own merits, separate from any land questions." "They're going to be in the same room in 2 days," she said, "and the people who are going to be speaking are not going to see them as separate." She paused. "I'd like you to consider withdrawing the complaint." He looked at her with something that was not quite amusement, but was adjacent to it. The look of a man who has done this enough times to find a direct challenge entertaining rather than concerning. "I don't think I'll do that," he said pleasantly. "I thought not." She held his gaze. "I've looked at your record in Jefferson County, Mr. Blackwell, and Beaverhead, and Madison." She watched his face. 4 cases. 1 loss, already in the territorial record. 2 settlements at below market value. 1 pending. She paused. "The board members here are going to know about those cases before they walk into that hearing room. I want you to know that." For the first time, the pleasant expression shifted, just slightly. Something underneath it went a few degrees colder. "That's not relevant to the complaint before the board," he said. "You might be right," she said, "but it's going to be in the room, and rooms have a way of letting things in once they're open." She stepped aside so he could pass. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwell." She walked on without looking back. Her heart was going harder than she'd have liked. She kept her pace steady and didn't reach for the fence rail she was passing, though for a moment she wanted to. Cole found her at the office that afternoon. He'd been to see Gus Heller, whose notarized statement was now in a brown envelope on the desk. He'd also gotten a reply from Margaret Pratt in Dillon, who had written back with more practical detail in 2 pages than most lawyers would have provided in 10. "She says the argument that worked was the use history," Cole said, "not the survey records. The board responded to documentation of actual private use over time. Photographs, witness accounts, dated receipts for work done on the creek bank. Evidence that it was never used as a public waterway because people were using it privately and had been for decades. Do you have that?" "I have Heller's statement, and I have 3 letters from the Greer family going back to when Old Man Greer first settled on the ridge, all of them referencing the creek as part of the private property. They're dated." He laid them on the desk beside Heller's envelope. "Mrs. Pratt also said," he paused, "she said to tell whoever was helping me that the clearest thing she could pass on was this. They want to see that you belong there. Not just that you have the right documents, that you are part of the place, that the place is part of you, that removing you would damage something real." Eleanor looked at the documents on the desk. Then she looked up at him. That's what I've been trying to do, she said, since the day I arrived. I know, he said. There was something in the room that hadn't quite been there before, or that had been there for a while and was only now clear enough to name. She felt it and didn't reach toward it. There was too much in the next 48 hours to reach toward anything, but she didn't look away from it either. The hearing's at 10 on Monday, she said. I want to go over the order of testimony one more time. He sat down and they went through it. Clara Briggs and her husband first because they were known in town and their story was clean and human. Then Holt, because an eyewitness to the night with Will Hartley was concrete and difficult to argue against. Then Daniel Reeves, because he was young and sick, and his improvement under Mercer's supervision was documented in the office records. Then the letter from Mrs. Garfield, read aloud by Mercer, because Lillian Garfield was 70 miles away in Billings by now, alive and at an appointment that Eleanor had made possible. And then Eleanor herself, last. Are you going to say? Cole asked. She thought about what Ruth Casper had told her. Feelings first, justification second. She thought about the street on the first day, her books in the mud, the 30 pairs of eyes that had not moved to help. She thought about 9 days running an office alone, and the boy named Thomas Briggs, and the letter from Mrs. Garfield that Mercer had read and set down without trusting his voice. I'm going to tell the truth, she said, about what I did and why, and what it cost, and what it produced. And I'm going to let them decide if that's something this town needs or not. They'll decide it is, Cole said. You don't know that. No, he admitted. But I've watched this town for 4 years, and I know that it's easier to decide someone is unnecessary until you see what disappears when they're gone. He looked at her. They've seen. They're not going to unmake that. She wanted to believe that. She mostly did. What she also knew was that wanting was not the same as having, and that 11 weeks in Red Hollow had taught her to hold both things at once, the hope and the knowledge that hope needed work behind it to mean anything. She picked up the pen. Let's go through it one more time, she said. Sunday night she couldn't sleep. She lay in the east-facing room with its wavy-paged books and its single wall hook, and she stared at the ceiling and listened to the ranch sounds and did not let herself run through the testimony order again, because she had run through it enough times that running through it again would be superstition rather than preparation. She thought instead about her sister in Boston with the 3 children and the difficult husband. She hadn't written in 3 weeks. She made a note to write tomorrow, after. She thought about Dr. Harmon, who had let her stay when she showed up and refused to leave. She wondered if he knew what she'd done with what he'd taught her. She thought she would write to him too eventually, when there was something definitive to report. She thought about the journal on the bedside table, the one that had been face down in the mud on the day she arrived. She picked it up and opened it. Day 1. The book survived. She turned to a fresh page. Tomorrow, she wrote, and then stopped. She sat with the pen over the paper for a long time. She didn't write anything else. Some things didn't need describing in advance. Some things needed to be lived through first and written down after, when you knew what they had been. She put the journal away and lay back down and listened to the wind, which was quieter than it had been all week. In the morning, there was work to do. She let herself sleep. The morning of the 14th was cold in the specific way that Montana saves for moments that already have enough weight to them. Eleanor was dressed before dawn. She stood at the east window in her best dress, the gray wool, the one she'd been saving since Boston for occasions that required it, and watched the sky go from black to the particular dark blue that comes just before light. Her hands were steady. She was grateful for that. She had done everything she could do. The testimony was organized. The documents were in order. The apprenticeship designation was filed. The people who had agreed to speak knew what they were going to say. What happened next was not entirely in her hands, and she had made her peace with that, or close enough to peace that the distance wasn't worth measuring. She went downstairs. Margaret was in the kitchen, already up, coffee made, and she looked at Eleanor when she came in with an expression that was not quite warmth. Margaret's face didn't traffic in warmth as a general rule, but was something adjacent and genuine. Sit, Margaret said. Eat something. I'm not hungry. Eat anyway. She set a plate down, eggs, bread, a piece of the salt pork she kept for mornings when the work was going to be hard. You don't want your stomach making noise in that room. Eleanor sat and ate, because Margaret was right, and because there was something steadying about the ordinary mechanics of breakfast on a day that felt like it had decided to be historical. Thorne came down at 5:30. He looked at Eleanor, at her gray dress and her careful posture, and he sat across from her and poured his own coffee and didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "I sent Blackwell a letter yesterday." She looked up. "I told him I was withdrawing my financial support from the water rights challenge against Ransom," he said. He held his cup with both hands, looking at it rather than at her. "And I told him that my participation in the land partnership was contingent on a review of his methods that I was not prepared to continue without." The kitchen was very quiet, except for the sounds of Margaret at the stove, who appeared not to be listening, which meant she was listening to everything. "That's not the same as withdrawing the complaint against me," Eleanor said carefully. "No." He looked up. "The complaint is filed in his name. I can't withdraw it, but I also will not be there today lending it weight." He paused. "I won't speak against you." She held his gaze. "What changed?" He was quiet for a moment. "You said I made better decisions with complete information." He set down his cup. "You were right, and I had been making decisions with incomplete information for about 2 years. She didn't push beyond that. There was more in it. She could see there was more. The old grief and the control it had become, and the way a man can walk a long distance down the wrong road before he has a reason to stop and look behind him. But it wasn't hers to excavate, and this morning wasn't the time." "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and looked at his plate and didn't say anything else, and that was enough. The county board met in the largest room in Red Hollow, which was the assembly hall attached to the east side of the general store. It held maybe 60 people with the chairs arranged the way they were, and by 9:45 it was nearly full. Eleanor stood outside with Dr. Mercer and felt the number of people in a way that was physical, a kind of pressure in the chest that was not entirely unpleasant but required management. "There are a lot of people here," she said. "Yes," Mercer said. "That could go either way." "It could." He looked at the door. "But most of them came because they wanted to see what you'd do. That's different from coming because they want to see you fail." Coles arrived at 5:10, with Gus Heller beside him, an old man, very old, with the particular presence of someone who has been in a landscape long enough to have absorbed some of it. He nodded at Eleanor with the matter-of-fact courtesy of a man who respects the weight of the moment without being theatrical about it. "Ready?" Cole said. "Ask me in 2 hours," she said. He almost smiled. They went in. The board sat at the front of the room, Ruth Casper on the left, Frank Abernathy in the middle, Harold Teague on the right. Ruth Casper's face was the composed neutral of someone who has conducted enough of these to know that showing your position early is a tactical error. Abernathy had the look of a man who had not slept well. Teague was writing something in a notebook and did not look up when they came in. Blackwell was already seated at the respondents' table with a man beside him who had the pressed suit, precise hair appearance of a Helena lawyer. The lawyer's name, Eleanor would learn, was Greer, no relation to the Ridge family, and he had the eyes of someone who processes rooms quickly and files what he finds there. He filed Eleanor and didn't appear concerned by what he found, which she noted. The hearing opened with the formal language, the complaint, the county statute, the procedural rules, and Eleanor sat through it with her hands folded on the table and her back straight and her face carefully arranged into the expression of someone who is paying close attention to everything and reacting to none of it. Blackwell's lawyer went first. He was good. Eleanor had expected him to be good, and he was, and being prepared for something did not make it comfortable to sit through. He laid out the case methodically. Territorial statute regarding unlicensed medical practice, the specific incidents during Mercer's illness when Eleanor had seen patients alone, the question of whether the retroactively filed apprenticeship designation constituted a legitimate correction or an attempt to evade accountability. He used the word dangerous twice. He used the phrase public safety 4 times. He spoke about the patients of Red Hollow County deserving qualified care, and he meant it to sound protective while meaning the opposite. When he finished, Abernathy leaned forward. "Dr. Mercer, the apprenticeship designation you filed, can you speak to the statute under which it was filed and why it was not filed earlier?" Mercer had been waiting for this. He answered with the careful precision of a man who has had 43 years to learn that precision is its own kind of authority. He explained the statute, its provisions, the fact that there was no temporal limitation on designation. He explained that the designation reflected a formal recognition of an arrangement that had been operating within the statute's terms from the beginning. He explained it without apology and without over-explaining, which was harder than it sounded. Then Ruth Casper said, "I'd like to hear from the patients." Blackwell's lawyer started to object, and Ruth Casper looked at him with the expression of a woman who has been looked at that way by better men and remained unmoved. "Overruled," she said, which she had the authority to say as chair. Clara Briggs spoke first. She was not a woman who made speeches. She sat in the chair at the front of the room, and she said plainly what had happened with Thomas's hand, what Eleanor had told her about the fever in October, what it had meant to her, in the specific and practical terms of a woman who had been scared and had been given something useful to do with the fear. "She didn't pretend she was a doctor," Clara said. "She told me what she knew and what she didn't know, and she told me when to get Dr. Mercer and when I could wait. That's what I needed." She looked at the board. "That's what my son needed." Her husband spoke after her, shorter, more uncomfortable with the room, but clear. He'd been in the bunkhouse that night with Will. He'd seen what Eleanor did, and he said so. Holt said even less, but said it in a way that settled into the room and stayed. He was not a man who embellished, and the board seemed to understand that, and so what he said carried the weight of its own plainness. Daniel Reeves had taken the stage from Mercer's waiting room to the hearing, and he was still not well, which was visible, and which was also its own testimony. He spoke about the appointment in October, about the fact that without Mercer's office and Eleanor's careful notes on his case, he might have dismissed what was happening to him as ordinary winter sickness until it was something worse. He was 23 years old, and he spoke with the directness of someone who has recently become acquainted with his own mortality and has not yet started performing unconcern about it. When he sat back down, the room was very quiet. Mercer read Mrs. Garfield's letter. He read it slowly, pausing once near the middle, and Eleanor knew it was because his voice was doing something he didn't want it to do. He got through it. The letter was precise and affectionate and detailed, and it ended, "I am alive and in Billings, because a woman in Red Hollow took my symptoms seriously and refused to allow me to go home without a plan. That is what medicine is supposed to do." Abernathy was looking at the letter when Mercer finished, as though he could read it from across the room. Teague had stopped writing in his notebook. Then it was Eleanor's turn. She walked to the front of the room and stood, not sat, she had decided to stand, and she looked at the three board members and at the room behind them, and she took a breath. She did not begin with the legal argument. She began with the street, her first day, her books in the mud. She said it plainly, without dramatics because it didn't need any. She said what she'd come west with and why. She said what she'd found at Mercer's office and what she'd understood about what was needed there and what she'd done about it. She talked about Dr. Harmon in Boston and what he'd taught her and why. She talked about Will Hartley and Thomas Briggs and Daniel Reeves and Mrs. Garfield. And she talked about what it felt like to be the only person with certain knowledge in a room where someone needed it. She talked about the line she'd held, every time, between what she knew she could do and what she'd deferred to Mercer to decide, and why that line was real and not a legal convenience. And then she said what she hadn't entirely planned to say, but which came out because it was the thing underneath everything else. And it was the 14th of December in a cold assembly room in Red Hollow, Montana, and she was tired of carrying it without putting it down somewhere. "I did not come here to prove something," she said. "I came because I had nowhere else to go and because a man wrote me a letter that turned out to mean something different than it said. I stayed because this work matters, and because the people in this town needed it, and because I was good at it, and I had spent a long time in places that wanted me to be less good at it than I was, and I wasn't willing to do that anymore." She paused. "I'm not asking you to give me something I didn't earn. I'm asking you to look at what I earned and call it what it is." She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually do. Then Blackwell's lawyer rose to cross-examine her, and he asked 12 questions, methodical and pointed, and she answered every one of them directly and completely and without the kind of defensive elaboration that sounds like uncertainty. On the last question, "Can you point to any formal credential, any examination, any certification that qualifies you to provide the care you've described?" She said, "I can point to the patients in this room who are alive and healthy because of what I did. I can point to Dr. Silas Mercer's formal designation. I can point to 43 years of territorial statute that created a pathway for exactly this kind of apprenticeship. And I can point to the fact that before I arrived in this county, there was one physician covering 120 square miles alone. She looked at the lawyer. What credential would satisfy you, and who in this county holds it? He sat down. Ruth Casper said, "The board will deliberate." They waited in the cold outside because the assembly room was needed for the deliberation, and because the cold was preferable to the particular atmosphere of a room where everyone is pretending not to watch everyone else. Cole stood near Eleanor without standing too close, which she understood as a kind of respect, giving her the space to be in whatever she was in without making her manage his presence on top of it. Dr. Mercer sat on the bench outside the general store with his coat buttoned and his hat on his knee and his eyes closed, which might have been meditation or might have been an old man resting, or both. Clara Briggs brought Eleanor a cup of coffee from somewhere and pressed it into her hands and said nothing, which was exactly right. The deliberation took 40 minutes, which was either long or short, depending on how you measured 40 minutes, when you were standing in the cold in December waiting for people to decide whether what you'd built with your own hands for 3.5 months was real. Eleanor drank the coffee and watched the street and thought about the journal entry she hadn't finished the night before. She thought about what she would write tonight after. She thought about her sister. She thought about her books, still slightly wavy from the mud, stacked on the shelf in the east-facing room where she'd read them by lantern light on the nights when she couldn't sleep. How they'd survived. How most things, given enough care, found a way to survive. The door opened. Ruth Casper appeared first, which told Eleanor something before a word was spoken. Ruth Casper walked like a woman delivering news she's satisfied with. "The board has reached a decision," she said. "Will you come back in?" The decision was this. The complaint was not sustained. The apprenticeship designation was recognized as valid under territorial statute. Eleanor Whitmore's activities during Dr. Mercer's illness were found to fall within the scope of the designation's provisions. The board found no evidence of unlicensed medical practice. Additionally, and this was the part that Ruth Casper read with the particular emphasis of someone who had argued for its inclusion, the board formally recommended that the county petition the Territorial Medical Board to establish a pathway for frontier medical apprentices to sit for a licensing examination, citing the documented need in rural counties for trained practitioners operating under physician oversight. It was not everything. It was not a license. But it was a door, and it was open, and Eleanor understood the difference between a door and a destination. Abernathy voted yes. So did Teague. So did Ruth. 3-0. Blackwell's lawyer was already packing his briefcase before the vote was fully recorded. Eleanor sat at the table and looked at the surface of it. The scratched wood, the water ring from someone's cup, the perfectly ordinary material reality of a table in a county assembly room. And let the moment be what it was without trying to make it larger or smaller than its actual size. Dr. Mercer put his hand on her shoulder briefly. That was all. It was enough. Blackwell left Red Hollow the following morning. He did not speak to Eleanor before he left. He did not speak to Thorne, as far as she knew, which was information in itself. Cole filed his response to Blackwell's water rights challenge on the same day as the hearing outcome, attaching the board decision as an exhibit, not because it was directly relevant to the water question, but because it established a record of the context in which Blackwell was operating. Gus Heller's notarized statement went in. The Greer family letters went in. The argument was thorough and documented, and it carried the weight of things that were true and could be proved. 3 weeks later, the challenge was withdrawn. Cole told Eleanor this on a Tuesday afternoon, not dramatically. He came into the office and sat in the chair across from her desk and said, "He dropped it." And she said, "When?" And he said, "Filed yesterday." And she said, "Good." And they sat with it for a moment, the two of them, in the quiet of a room that smelled of carbolic and organized paper and coffee that was probably cold by now. "You gonna be all right?" she asked. He looked at her. "You're asking me that. I'm asking you that." "Yes," he said. "I've been all right before. It gets easier with practice." He looked at his hands. "What about the territorial examination?" "Mercer wrote to the Territorial Medical Board last week. He's expecting a reply in January." She straightened a folder on her desk that didn't need straightening. "It might take a year, it might take 3 years. The process for establishing the examination pathway is Not fast. You'll do it anyway. I'll do it anyway. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, December was doing what December in Montana does, which is making the previous months look gentle. But the office was warm, the stove going, and the light from the window was the pale, sharp light of winter that finds everything it touches and makes it clear. I want to ask you something, Cole said. She looked at him. The arrangement with Thorne, he said. What are you going to do about it? She had been thinking about this. She had been thinking about it since the morning after the hearing, when Thorne had come to breakfast and been quieter than usual, and had not looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the early weeks, assessing, calculating, sizing up a problem, but in a way that was harder to categorize. Something that was not quite apology, but was in the same neighborhood. I'm going to dissolve it, she said. The agreement allows for mutual dissolution with 30 days' notice. I'll give the notice this week. She paused. I'll find a room in town. Mercer's offered to help with the cost until the wage is enough to cover it, which he estimates will be spring. Cole nodded slowly. I'm not leaving Red Hollow, she said, in case that was part of what he was asking. I know, he said. I wasn't asking if you were leaving. She looked at him. The fire shifted in the stove. Somewhere down the street a door closed. The ordinary sounds of a town in winter, which were the same sounds she'd heard on the day she arrived, and which now carried a different weight simply because she knew what was making them. Then what were you asking? She said. He met her eyes, and in the particular stillness that was his version of deliberateness, he said, whether you'd be willing to have dinner sometime, at my place or in town, either one. Just that. She looked at him for a moment, at the man who had sat in this office chair through a November and a December, and had told her things that were true when it would have been easier not to, and who had never once looked at her the way most people looked at her, as a problem or a surprise or a category to manage, but as a person in possession of herself, which was rarer than it should have been. Yes, she said, I'd be willing to do that. He nodded. He picked up his hat. Saturday? He said. Saturday, she said. He left and she turned back to the desk, and the folder that had needed straightening was still slightly crooked, and she straightened it properly this time and went back to work. She gave Thorne the dissolution notice that evening. He read it at the desk in his study and set it down and looked at her. This is what you want, he said. It wasn't quite a question. It's what's right, she said. What I want and what's right happen to be the same thing in this case. He was quiet for a moment. I'm aware that I could have been different about this, from the beginning. Yes, she said, simply. Not to wound him with it, but because he'd said something honest and it deserved an honest answer. What I did that first day, he said. You don't have to. The books, he said. I've thought about it. He looked at the window. My wife had books. She kept them everywhere. It was the first thing I noticed about her. He stopped. When I saw you step off that stage with that case, I knew immediately what was in it without knowing why I knew. And something... He shook his head. It doesn't excuse it. I know that. She looked at him. This man who had spent 12 years building walls out of grief and calling them ranch management, who had made a decision in 30 seconds on a street that he had been paying for since, in ways he probably hadn't expected. No, she said. It doesn't excuse it, but I think I understand it better than I did. She paused. You might consider speaking to someone about your wife, not a physician, just someone who knew her, someone you trust. She held his gaze. Grief that doesn't move eventually becomes the whole house. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face that was difficult to name, but was not the flatness she'd first encountered. You're a strange woman, Eleanor Whitmore, he said. I've been told, she said. Good night, Mr. Thorne. She found a room in town in January, on the upper floor of a widow's house 2 streets from the office, with a window that faced south this time, and more light than the east-facing room had ever managed. She moved her books to the new shelves, still wavy, still slightly mud-marked on the spines, and put her journal on the table beside the bed. She opened it to the entry from her first night. Day 1. The book survived. She read it for a moment. Then she turned to a fresh page and wrote the date. 3 months and some days since Red Hollow, she wrote. The Territorial Medical Board has replied to Mercer's petition. They are considering a proposal for frontier licensing examination. No timeline yet. In the meantime, I am doing what I have been doing, which is the work itself, which has not waited for the paperwork. She paused, pen over the page, thinking about what else was true. Thomas Briggs's hand healed without any lasting damage. Daniel Reeves is improving slowly. We don't know yet how far the improvement will go, and I am learning to hold that uncertainty without letting it become despair. Mrs. Garfield is alive in Billings. Will Hartley came to town last week on his own for the first time and stood in the office door and said he was fine and looked fine, which is not the same as being fine, but was close enough that I didn't argue. Mercer is teaching me things he never taught me because he never thought he'd need to. I think he is also preparing for something, but neither of us has said so directly because some things are better approached sideways. She stopped, thought about what was true that she hadn't written yet. Cole Ransom's land is his. The challenge was withdrawn. He came to the office Tuesday and said so in fewer words than it took me to understand what it meant, which seems consistent with his general approach to things. She paused longer this time. I had dinner Saturday at his ranch. It was not remarkable, except that it was. He makes coffee badly, and his house is very clean, and he asked me 3 questions about things I hadn't expected him to have been thinking about, and I asked him 3 questions in return, and we sat with the answers for a while before talking about something else. I think this is what it looks like when 2 people who are careful about where they put their trust decide that the other person has earned some of it, not all at once, not without watching, but genuinely. She put the pen down and read what she'd written. Here is what she had come to understand in 3.5 months in Red Hollow, Montana, which she had not understood fully in Boston, though some part of her had been moving toward it for years. The world does not often make room for people it isn't expecting. The room has to be made. It has to be made with your own hands, from whatever is available, while people are telling you it isn't yours to make. It is slow work, and it is imperfect work. And there will be days when the mud gets in the mechanisms and the pages stick together and you sit on the edge of a bed in a strange room and wonder if the thing you're doing is courage or simply stubbornness that's found a direction. The answer, she had decided, was that it didn't matter which. Both will get you through a winter. Both will get you standing in a county assembly room telling the truth out loud while people decide whether to believe it. Both will get you to the morning after, which is where the real work is. She had been told, for most of her life, that her intelligence was a problem, that it created inconveniences, that it made people uncomfortable and situations complicated, and that a woman who knew too much was a woman who was asking for the specific difficulties that her knowledge would cause. What she had found, in the end, was not that the world had changed its mind about this. The world had not changed its mind. There were still men like Caleb Thorne and Victor Blackwell, and the school that had hired the man with half her qualifications, and the boarding house in Boston, and the 30 pairs of eyes that had watched her books go into the mud and not moved. What she had found was that none of those things had been able to stop her, and that not being stopped was its own kind of answer to the question of whether she belonged here. She did belong here. She had made the room. The room existed. In the spring, she would sit for the examination if it was offered. She would pass it, because she had been preparing for it her entire adult life without knowing that was what she was doing. She would go on treating the patients who came to her and the ones who came to Mercer, and eventually the line between those 2 categories would blur, in the way it blurs when a town stops thinking of someone as new. In the spring, Cole Ransom would come to town on a Saturday, and they would walk along the main street and argue amiably about something, and she would win the argument, and he would know she had won and not mind it, which was the thing she had needed to find and had not known she was looking for. Doctor. Mercer would teach her everything he knew, and she would learn it, and eventually she would know things he hadn't taught her because she'd found them herself. And he would be glad of it in the specific way of teachers who outlive their usefulness by producing someone who doesn't need them anymore. The books on the shelf were still wavy. They would always be wavy. She had stopped minding. She closed the journal and set it on the table and looked at the south-facing window, where the light in January was thin and precise, and found everything it touched and made it clear. She had come west looking for someone who would value her mind. What she had learned, the thing underneath the thing, the one that took 3 months in a mud-filled street and a bunkhouse by lantern light in a county assembly room to understand, was that she had never actually needed someone to value it. She had needed to be somewhere that couldn't survive without it. Red Hollow had been that place. She had known it the first week, without the language for it. She knew it now with the language, and with the record to prove it, and with the people who had stood in a room and said so out loud. The journal stayed closed. She picked up her pen and the Henderson file and went to work.